Chihuahuan Desert, 1889. The herd needed water in 18 miles. The Army survey map said so, marked clear as gospel. But Thomas Hale, 47 years old, former drover who'd learned desert survival from Mexican vaqueros and Mescalero Apache laborers, said that stream hadn't flowed since before the war. His fellow hands called it nonsense. The map was official. The route was proven. Why would they trust cactus tricks over documented sources? Hale carried a 12-pound belt knife and stopped near prickly pear stands, showing younger hands how to singe off barbs and slice the pads. They called it primitive, Indian foolishness, last-ditch desperation. Then, 19 miles later, after 11 hours pushing cattle through 100-degree heat, they found the streambed, bone dry, mesquite roots exposed 18 inches deep, no water for years. 3 men showed signs of heat exhaustion by nightfall. No water, no dew. Each man needed a gallon minimum just to function. Hale cut open the cactus. Others refused. By morning, the men who'd mocked him could barely stand, while Hale was walking. What did he understand about the desert that official maps and institutional authority completely missed? If you respect real stories that carry lessons worth passing on, make sure to subscribe. There are more historical accounts ahead. Comment your city and time so we know where this documentary found you. We appreciate every viewer who joins in. The cattle drive assembled outside Fort Stockton on the morning of September 12, 1889. 73 head of longhorns, destined for the railhead at Carlsbad, New Mexico, 140 miles northwest across desert plateau that averaged less than 10 inches of rain per year. The trail boss, James Whitlock, carried an Army Corps of Engineers survey map dated 1874, 15 years old, but considered reliable. Water sources were marked at precise intervals: 18 miles to Comanche Creek, 22 miles beyond that to Rattlesnake Springs, then a final push to the Pecos River crossing. The schedule allowed for 3 days of travel with minimal rest, standard practice for experienced outfits moving cattle through established routes. Thomas Hale stood near the remuda, checking his gear with the methodical attention that other drovers found excessive. He carried a 12-pound Bowie knife with an 8-inch blade, 2 pairs of leather gloves when most men carried 1, and a canteen wrapped in burlap soaked in water for evaporative cooling. At 47, he'd spent 23 years moving cattle between Texas and New Mexico, learning desert work from men who'd been born to it. Miguel Ortega, a vaquero from Chihuahua, had shown him how to read terrain for hidden water. A Mescalero Apache laborer, whose name was never written down, had taught him which plants held moisture and which would poison a man within hours. When Whitlock unrolled the survey map that evening, Hale studied the marked water source at Comanche Creek and shook his head. "That stream hasn't run since before the war," he said quietly. "Cottonwoods are dead along that stretch. Ground's alkali now." Whitlock looked up from the map with the expression of a man being told his pocket watch was lying. "This is Army Corps documentation," he said. "Updated routes, 18 miles to water, marked and surveyed." The other hands nodded agreement. Eli Turner, a younger drover on his second long drive, laughed outright. "You planning to drink cactus juice, Tom? Save that Indian nonsense for when we're actually dying." The herd moved out at dawn under a sky that promised no mercy. By mid-morning, the temperature had climbed past 95 degrees, and the cattle began spacing themselves wider apart, instinctively seeking any breath of air that wasn't heated by the animal beside them. Hale rode near the rear, watching the ground. The mesquite was sparse and low, the kind that grew when groundwater sat 8 feet down or deeper. No green anywhere except the occasional prickly pear stand, their flat pads thick with stored moisture. 19 miles in, after 11 hours of steady pushing through heat that turned the air itself into a visible shimmer, they reached the marked coordinates for Comanche Creek. The streambed was there, exactly where the map promised. But it held nothing except cracked clay and exposed mesquite roots driven 18 inches into earth that hadn't seen surface water in years. No algae stains on the rocks, no water lines, no mud smell. The cottonwoods that had once marked reliable flow were reduced to bleached stumps, their root systems long dead. Whitlock stood in the dry channel, holding the map like it might suddenly correct itself. The cattle milled in confusion, noses down, searching for water that every living thing understood should be there. By sunset, 3 of the hands were showing the signs Hale had learned to recognize. Heart rates above 120 beats per minute, skin dry to the touch, no urine production for over 24 hours. The temperature dropped to 82 degrees overnight, but no dew formed on the sparse vegetation. Each man needed a gallon of water per day minimum in these conditions. They had none. The herd had none. Turner sat against his saddle, face flushed, speaking too fast. "We push through," he said. "Rattlesnake Springs is 12 miles. We can make it by dawn." Whitlock stared at the map, then at the cattle, calculating losses. 5 to 10% of the herd would die if they stayed. More if they pushed without water. Hale stood and walked toward a cluster of prickly pear, 30 yards from camp, his knife already drawn. "We stop," he said, "and we use what the land has." Turner laughed, but the sound came out thin and desperate. "You want us to eat cactus? That's your plan?" Hale knelt beside the first plant, selecting a mature pad 8 inches long. "I want you to live," he said. Hale selected pads that were mature but not woody, 8 to 12 inches long, avoiding any showing insect damage or dark spots that indicated rot. The glochids, fine barbed spines invisible until they were already embedded in skin, covered the surface in dense clusters. He gathered dry grass and struck a match, passing each pad through the flame until the glochids singed away, leaving faint scorch marks on the green skin. The process took 3 minutes per pad. He worked through 6 of them, while the other men watched in silence. With his Bowie knife, he made a longitudinal cut down the center of the first pad, splitting it open to expose the translucent pulp inside. The interior was mucilaginous, thick and gel-like, holding moisture in a matrix that wouldn't evaporate even under direct sun. "You eat it slow," Hale said, cutting a section the size of his thumb. "Half a pad every 20 minutes. Any faster, and your stomach turns against you." He placed the piece in his mouth and chewed deliberately. The texture, somewhere between cucumber and aloe, slightly bitter but not unpleasant. The pulp was 85 to 90% water, but it was more than simple hydration. It carried electrolytes, calcium, potassium, magnesium, that sweat had stripped from their bodies over 11 hours of desert heat. The mucilage slowed absorption in the gut, preventing the rapid fluid shift that could trigger nausea or worse in a dehydrated man. Hale consumed 8 pads over the next 6 hours, taking breaks between each one, measuring his intake against his body's response. Each pad yielded roughly 4 to 6 ounces of usable liquid. By the time he'd finished, he'd taken in just over a quart of hydration. His core temperature, which had climbed above 101 degrees by mid-afternoon, stabilized below 99. Sweat returned to his skin. The dizziness that had started to press at the edges of his vision pulled back. 2 of the other hands refused to touch the cactus, insisting they'd find water at Rattlesnake Springs. Turner tried one pad, gagged, and threw the rest away. By midnight, one of the refusers collapsed, attempting to saddle his horse. Hale knelt beside him, forced pulp between his lips, and held his head until he swallowed. The man cursed him. Then he asked for more. The drive resumed at dawn, slower than Whitlock wanted, but faster than death. Hale rode ahead, reading the land the way Miguel Ortega had taught him. He watched for cottonwood stumps that still showed green cambium under the bark, a sign that roots reached living water even if the tree itself was dying. He noted insect density, the way gnats gathered in certain draws where soil stayed fractionally damper. He studied soil color, looking for the darker patches that meant moisture held closer to the surface. 7 miles northwest of the dry creek, he found what the map had never marked, a seep spring hidden in a limestone fold, flowing just enough to fill a depression the size of a wagon wheel. The cattle drank first, then the men. It took 4 hours to water the herd properly, rotating them in groups of 10 to avoid trampling the fragile source. By mid-afternoon, they were moving again. The crisis passed, but not forgotten. Only 3 head were lost, far below the 15 to 20 Whitlock had calculated as probable under sustained dehydration stress. The men who'd used the Cactus were functional within 36 hours. The 2 who'd refused needed 4 to 5 days before they could work a full day without collapsing. Turner approached Hale that evening as they made camp near the Pecos crossing. "Show me again," he said quietly. "The way you pick the pads, the cutting." Hale walked him through it step by step, the same way Ortega had shown him 12 years earlier on a drive that had nearly killed them both. Select mature pads, burn the glochids clean, slice longitudinal to expose pulp, consume slowly, measured, letting the body accept what the desert offered. Whitlock never apologized, but 2 weeks later, Hale overheard him telling another trail boss about water failures and cactus hydration, repeating the technique as if it were common knowledge that any sensible drover would already possess. The younger hands asked questions now instead of laughing. They carried knives suitable for plant work. They stopped near prickly pear stands and practiced the cuts on their own time, learning the difference between edible pads and the varieties that would make them sick. Hale said nothing about vindication. He simply repeated what Ortega had told him years before. The desert tells you what it has if you ask right. The Army Corps survey maps continued to be printed and sold through the 1890s, their water sources marked with the confidence of institutional authority, even as the desert itself changed beneath them. Streams that had run reliably during the wet cycles of the 1860s and 70s went intermittent or vanished entirely as rainfall patterns shifted. The maps aged 5, 10, 15 years without revision, and drovers who trusted documentation over observation paid in cattle, in time, and sometimes in lives. Historical records from the period document at least 17 major cattle drives that failed due to phantom water sources, locations marked on official surveys that held nothing but dry ground and broken promises. The knowledge Hale carried forward spread quietly through the working culture of the Southwest. It appeared in the journals of Texas Rangers operating in the Big Bend country, recorded without fanfare as standard desert practice. Mexican vaqueros had been using prickly pear hydration for generations, a technique so fundamental to survival in northern Chihuahua and Sonora that it needed no formal instruction. Indigenous groups across the region, Apache, Tohono O'odham, Yaqui, had refined the method over centuries, understanding not just which plants held water, but when to harvest them, how to process them, and what quantities the human body could tolerate before the mucilage caused digestive distress. By the early 1900s, the technique had migrated into Boy Scout survival manuals and military desert training protocols. Army officers preparing troops for Southwest operations included cactus hydration in their field instruction, teaching the same step-by-step process that Hale had learned from men whose names were never written into official records. Modern survival studies would later confirm the physiological effectiveness under controlled conditions, the electrolyte content, the mucilage's role in slowing absorption, the water percentage sufficient to sustain life when nothing else was available. The method that Termer had called primitive and Whitlock had dismissed as folklore became validated science, though it had never needed validation from anyone who'd actually cut open a prickly pear pad in 100-degree heat with no water and 18 miles still to travel. When records fail and authority guesses, survival belongs to those who learn the land the way it is, not the way someone once drew it on a map that was already outdated before the ink dried.